Welcome to this video lecture on the bureaucracy. The learning objectives for this lecture include explaining the characteristics, operation, and functioning of the federal bureaucracy, and explaining the structure and functions of California's bureaucracy, including the plural executive. So let's go ahead and get started. Welcome back. This week's lecture is on the bureaucracy, and we're going to focus on government bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is not something that's necessarily exclusive to government. Bureaucracy is, in its exact definition, it's a complex structure of offices, tasks, and rules. And it's used by large institutions, not just government, to coordinate work. And the bureaucracy is made up of bureaucrats, people who work in the bureaucracy. In government bureaucracy, bureaucrats implement laws, which usually means determining how to administer and enforce laws that Congress passes, and then they issue rules to guide the implementation of these laws. That can become its own separate type of law, known as administrative law. And then they enforce laws. They exercise considerable power over private industry and individuals. I'll give you an example. Think about the IRS enforcing tax collection, or, say that there's some type of company that is polluting the soil when it's trying to drill for oil. That might be something that the Environmental Protection Agency would issue a finding about, or try to fine the company for causing that pollution. Managing the bureaucracy is the job of Congress. While the president has direct management over the bureaucracy, the task of keeping the bureaucracy honest and not corrupt is supposed to be the job of Congress. And this is known as congressional oversight. And what this does is it involves Congress exercising control over activities in executive agencies. And this is done through congressional hearings, investigations, and other techniques. And functionally, the way that this usually works is members of Congress sit on certain committees, as we've mentioned in previous weeks. And these committees have different themes, different topics that they focus on. And members of Congress love having oversight hearings, because what they can do is they can really make themselves look good by seeming to keep the government honest and cracking down on corruption. And this plays really well on TV back home in their states and districts. And so oftentimes they love to bring down bureaucrats from some of the most hated bureaucratic agencies like the IRS, and they go through their budgets, their emails, all of which are public, and they'll put these bureaucrats on the spot and try to embarrass them and make them look like they're doing things that are ridiculous. And so that's a real function of Congress, to make sure that there are eyes on the bureaucracy, to make sure that nothing corrupt or illegal is happening. But also, there is the part of it where members of Congress are using this function to make themselves look good to be reelected. There are three agencies within Congress that help with oversight: the GAO, the Congressional Research Service, and the Congressional Budget Office. The GAO stands for Government Accountability Office. Let's take a closer look at the workers who staff the bureaucracy. The technical term for the government workforce is the civil service. These are the people who work in the bureaucracy, and they typically spend their entire career working in the bureaucracy. They're hired based on their experience, and they're supposed to be nonpartisan. So these are career government employees, civil servants who are working in the government to help the government function. The civil service wasn't always based on experience and merit. In fact, from the presidency of Andrew Jackson starting in 1829 all the way up until the end of the 19th century, the bureaucracy operated on something known as the spoils system, in which the president, higher up political officials, would use jobs in the civil service as a reward for political connections, and this led to a lot of corruption. So in 1883, Congress passed the Pendleton Civil Service Act, and this created a hiring system for bureaucracy that was based on merit and experience, not on who you knew. And this was further changed by the Civil Service Reform Act of 1978, which created the Merit Systems Protection Board, which was meant to oversee the process and make sure that workers were indeed being hired for experience, not because of some family connection or friend connection. Now, I want to make sure that you understand we're focusing on the civil service, people who are kind of lower level bureaucrats, career bureaucrats, and not people who are being appointed by the president as a political appointee, like a cabinet secretary or an agency director. Those individuals do get their jobs based on their partisan connections. And the president has a direct ability to fill roughly about 550 of these positions, these political appointees. And very much so, these positions do still operate on a bit of a spoils system, where the president is rewarding other people in the party or other people who have contributed to their campaign. Sometimes the president does pick people who seem to be qualified, but oftentimes it is a way of rewarding their most prominent supporters. Another important federal law that was passed to reform the federal bureaucracy was the Hatch Act of 1939, which prohibits political activity by federal employees. And this basically includes the entire bureaucracy with the exception of the president and vice president, because they're the only members of the federal bureaucracy, the federal executive branch, who actually campaign for their office. And so nobody else is supposed to engage in any kind of political activity or campaigning. And so this actually means that the White House is really not supposed to be used by anybody other than the president and the vice president for anything that could be seen as partisan activity or campaigning. The cabinet is part of the federal bureaucracy, and the cabinet includes the heads, the secretaries of the 15 executive departments. That would be, for example, the Department of Defense, the State Department, the Department of Justice, etc., etc. And just a little bit of background, the cabinet was actually established by George Washington. The first executive departments were created in the Washington administration, and those first three executive departments were the Department of State, the Department of War, and the Department of the Treasury. Other parts of the bureaucracy include independent agencies, and just as it sounds, they are independent. They operate separately from the executive departments, the departments that I just mentioned on the previous slide. These independent agencies are completely separate. They have been established by Congress. The president still appoints and directs the heads of these agencies, but they're like smaller departments that do their own thing. They are not underneath another department. They are their own separate entity. For example, the CIA is an independent agency. Independent means it's independent of other departments, but it's still under the purview of the president. There are three types of these independent agencies. They include independent executive agencies, independent regulatory commissions, and government corporations. So we're going to look at a couple of these here in just a moment. One of the three types of independent agencies would be independent executive agencies. These are agencies that have powers similar to the executive departments, and their leaders, their heads, are appointed by the president, but they are not part of the cabinet. An example would be NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. So typically the independent executive agencies tend to have a more narrow focus. So, for instance, NASA is focused on the civilian space program, as well as aeronautics and space research. The bigger executive departments have much, much more broad topics that they cover. So these independent executive agencies typically have a very narrow focus. Now we're going to look at government corporations and independent regulatory commissions. Government corporations are agencies that perform market-oriented public services. So what that means is basically there's something the government does and they're trying to run it like a business. They're trying to make sure that it's self-sustaining financially, although they never really are. They always run a deficit. Examples would be Amtrak and the United States Postal Service. So they're supposed to raise their own revenues to fund the services that they provide. But there's some debate over whether this is really a great model, because it seems as though the point of these agencies are to provide services to the public where maybe the private sector won't do it because it's too expensive. And then it inevitably ends up costing a lot of money, and then Congress has to figure out how they're going to come up with the funds, and there are arguments over whether these services are needed or not. But long story short, this is a government corporation. It's an agency that is essentially supposed to act like a business, but it's still owned by the government. And then we have independent regulatory commissions. These are rulemaking bodies. Remember, I talked about rules that the bureaucrats will make based on laws that Congress passes. That's what independent regulatory commissions do. They are rulemaking bodies that are supposed to be insulated from politics, although their leaders are appointed by the president. And this would be, for example, the Federal Communications Commission, which oversees policy and rules for things like the internet, for cell phone usage, TV, regulations. Let's take a look at something known as the Iron Triangle. Iron Triangle is referring to the unofficial alliance of congressional committees, which we've talked about before. Remember, that's where all the work gets done in Congress. Interest groups, which are groups that represent a certain sector of the economy or a certain group that has an interest in having government do something for them. Could be a nonprofit, could be some kind of grassroots group. And then bureaucratic agencies. So example, let's say up at the top example here, our interest group is the National Cotton Council, and they are joined by another interest group, the National Association of Wheat Growers. So a couple of farm-related interest groups that represent farmers, basically. Farmers who produce the cotton and farmers who produce wheat. That would be the interest group, part of this triangle. Over on the left, we have the Farm Service Agency. That would be the federal bureaucratic agency involved. And then we have, over on the right, the Agriculture Committee for the House of Representatives. And so what ends up happening is under an iron triangle, and that's an unofficial term. That's something that political scientists have used to describe the way that these entities work together. They usually get together to work out new rules or legislation or reform for the specific industry. So if we look at the middle triangle, we have the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, we've got the Army Corps of Engineers, and then below we've got the National Rivers and Harbors Congress and the Mississippi Valley Association. So if we had to guess, we've got the government entity that oversees the engineering of levees alongside rivers, and then we've got the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. And then below, these interest groups are probably coming to Congress to ask them to either maintain a dam or maybe provide more funding to refurbish some levees or dams, or perhaps devote more money to dredging certain waterways, or maybe pass some type of legislation about that. And then down at the bottom, we have the House Veterans Affairs Committee representing the legislative part of this. Over on the left, the Department of Veterans Affairs. This would be the bureaucratic agency representing that side. And then below, we've got the American Legion and Veterans of Foreign Wars. And so they're probably getting together to pass something that relates to veterans, maybe veterans health care, maybe veteran long-term care or end-of-life care, something that together they'll come and try to work out something that works for everybody. That's typically what the Iron Triangle is doing. It's interest group coming with two of the branches of government together, the legislative and the executive, and they're negotiating new rules or a new law. Why do we call it the Iron Triangle? If you notice, the triangle does not include the public or voters, and so that's why it's the Iron Triangle. Outsiders can't gain access, and so it's associated with a lack of transparency. Now let's talk about the federal budget. The federal budget is the budget that basically is issued by Congress every year. They allocate money for the bureaucracy to spend on its operations. And the way that this works, the president introduces the budget every year. The Congressional Budget Office reviews it. That's the office within Congress that basically is filled with a bunch of number crunchers and accountants and financial analysts, and they look at the president's budget and they come out with what's supposed to be a nonpartisan review of the budget. Then, if everything works the way it's supposed to, both houses of Congress pass a budget resolution. Now, it's a budget resolution. It's like a blueprint. It doesn't actually issue the money at this point. It's basically a wish list for what the president wants to spend the money on in the executive branch. And then when Congress passes the budget resolution, it's usually different than what the president wants, especially if we have political parties different from the president's political parties controlling Congress. So the president doesn't sign the budget resolution. It's a blueprint. Then to actually issue and approve the money, the Appropriations Committee in each house, the House of Representatives and then the Senate, will create a lot of spending bills, typically one spending bill for each major department within the bureaucracy. And so there's usually anywhere from 12 to 13 major appropriations bills. And then if everything gets approved, all of these bills get approved, then when the new fiscal year starts October 1st, the money is in the account for all these different departments and agencies and commissions and little offices that are within each of the major departments. Now, what happens if for some reason Congress doesn't approve and the president doesn't sign, because all of these appropriations bills must be signed by the president to become law? What if somewhere along the way at least one or maybe all of these appropriation bills don't make it out of Congress? The political parties can't agree, or maybe the president won't sign any of them, or maybe at least one of them. That's when we have a government shutdown. If we get to October 1st and the Congress and president have not agreed on new appropriations bills, then the government shuts down because the money is not in their account and they need that money to operate. The government can't operate without money in its account. Now, you might say, well, why doesn't the executive branch just borrow money? Well, they have to be authorized to borrow money. So typically what happens is the federal government always runs a deficit. And so that deficit has to be authorized by Congress. Congress has to say, okay, our federal budget is going to be $4.5 trillion, but our tax revenues only cover $4 trillion of that. The other $500 billion will have to be raised through the sale of government bonds, and we're authorizing that. So all of it has to be authorized by Congress. When we get to October 1st and the new fiscal year starts and nothing's been approved, the government has to shut down. Let's take a look at how the federal budget is funded. Personal income taxes make up the largest share of federal revenue. The United States has what's called a progressive tax, where tax rates rise depending on the amount of money that a person makes. So people who are at the lower end of the income scale usually have a lower percentage of their income that they have to pay, and that percentage rises the more money that they make. The second largest share of federal revenue would be payroll taxes, such as Social Security and Medicare. Now, as I mentioned before, the federal government can run a deficit if they're spending more than they take in. And this might sound weird, like why can the government do this? Why can the government go into debt? Actually, the government pretty much always runs a deficit. And long story short, the fact that the government borrows money is not necessarily bad because the government sells bonds, which are an important part of the investment market for private and commercial investors. And so government bonds sold by the United States are actually pretty reliable. And so they tend to be purchased, pretty in large amounts. And so that helps the government function. It's an important kind of a safe investment for people outside of the stock market. So it's not a bad thing that the government has to borrow money. However, if the government borrows too much money over time, it's going to need to pay interest on that debt. And if the interest rates or if the amount of interest gets too high, those interest rates might start going up because now people are saying, wow, I don't know if this is good that the government has this much debt. I'm feeling as though maybe the government won't pay it back. And so then the government has to make it more appealing to investors, and so they increase the interest rate to give more money back to investors. So if debt goes up and interest rates go up, it can potentially become a problem. The United States has not really had that problem. There are other countries, for instance, Greece in the European Union had a problem with taking on too much debt and having its interest rates go really high, which meant that any new debt that they borrowed to pay off the old debt was more expensive than the old debt. And Greece had a fiscal crisis during the recession of 2008 through 2011. When the government issues its budget, there are two types of spending. There's mandatory spending and discretionary spending. Mandatory spending is spending that's set by law. Discretionary is spending that needs to be reapproved every year. And so it's always discretionary spending where the fights happen in Congress that tend to hold everything up. Now, there are two different things going on when it comes to how money works at the federal level. We have fiscal versus monetary policies, and you should know the difference between the two. Fiscal policies is how the government spends and raises money, meaning how they tax, how they then turn around and spend that money in the budget. That's fiscal policy. Monetary policy is how the money supply is controlled, and that is set by the Federal Reserve, which is basically the central bank of the United States. And the Federal Reserve can do the following to enact monetary policy. So to increase the money supply, and when I say money supply, I literally mean the amount of money that's circulating and sloshing around in the economy that we all have in our pockets and our bank accounts. More money in the economy, that's a good thing. It means the economy is speeding up. Although if there's way too much money, that can be a problem. It can lead to inflation. So let's say the Federal Reserve wants to increase the amount of money that is flowing through the economy. They can do things like lowering the interest rate on certain types of bonds. They can lower the reserve requirements. Those are requirements for how much money banks need to keep in their vaults. Usually it's from 5 to 10% is typically what the reserve requirements are generally, but the Federal Reserve can increase those, or the Federal Reserve can buy bonds from investors. Now, to decrease the money supply, to slow down the economy, this is basically where the Federal Reserve takes money out of our pockets to try to get us to slow down our spending. So they can do that by raising certain types of interest rates to make it more expensive to take out loans. They can raise reserve requirements, so now banks are not able to loan out as much money. Or they can sell bonds, basically take money right out of our pockets. Say, hey, we'll sell you a $100 government bond. You have to hold on to it for a year. That means you can't spend that money. We're going to hold on to that $100 in our banks instead. Now let's take a little look at California's bureaucracy. California is unusual if we compare it to the federal bureaucracy because the president has total control over the bureaucracy, meaning that there's no other elected official that's part of the federal bureaucracy that can control certain parts of the federal bureaucracy. But California's governor is different because California is part of something known as the plural executive. There are actually 8 elected officers overseeing different parts of the state bureaucracy. And so some of those elected officials oversee their own independent bureaucratic departments, such as the Attorney General, who oversees the Department of Justice, the Insurance Commissioner, who oversees the Department of Insurance, and the State Superintendent of Education, who oversees the Department of Education. The governor oversees 7 super agencies. That's literally what they're called, super agencies. These are the equivalent of the big departments at the federal level. So they all have cabinet secretaries that report back to the governor and are appointed by the governor. There are also several cabinet level departments, including the Department of Finance. And the Department of Finance is pretty important because they compile the state budget. And the state budget is just as important at the state level as the federal budget is at the federal level. So just a little bit of background. California's state government has about 400,000 employees, including people who work in the California State University and University of California systems. The state budget pays all of their salaries and pays all of the operating budgets for all parts of California's government. Now, the state budget works like this. The governor releases their budget proposal in January, and then typically, after taking a look at how the economy is doing, how tax revenues are going, the governor will update that budget proposal in May. In the last decade or so, it's usually come in around $150 billion. It's funded by personal, sales, and corporate taxes. And so depending on how the economy is doing, it can cause tax revenues to go up or go down. The Department of Finance creates this budget after all parts of the bureaucracy submit their budget requests. And this process usually begins in the summer, right after the new budget has been approved, sometime in June. And then it lasts all the way until the following May, right before the budget is approved again. And basically, every single office that wants more money, more positions, they have to send what's known as a BCP, a budget change proposal, to the Department of Finance. The Department of Finance then has a conversation with that office. They basically go back and forth. Pretty much all the time, the Department of Finance will tell that office they need to cut their proposal down as much as possible or provide more information because they're not really explaining themselves very well. The Department of Finance is pretty feared throughout California bureaucracy because they are the bean counters and they are always skeptical about everything. And so they're a little intimidating for the rest of the folks throughout the bureaucracy. The budget has to be approved by the California State Legislature and signed by the governor before the start of the next fiscal year that begins on July 1st. You have now reached the end of this video lecture on the bureaucracy and should now be able to understand and explain the characteristics, operation, and functioning of the bureaucracy and the structure and functions of California's bureaucracy, including the plural executive.